Welcome to tonight's show. On the show tonight, we're going to talk about the cruise news from last week. We're going to go through and look at what the information came from Royal Caribbean, the information came from NCL. At the very end, we're going to talk a little bit about some port information that just came out. If we're meeting for the first time, my name is Ken Edmonds, and on this channel, I help people that travel with disabilities to travel better. I share tips and tricks that makes life easier, and I share information for their families as well. Hold on, I'll pop up my screen here. There we go. So we start off, as I mentioned, we're going to go through the some news. The first one we'll talk about is Richard Fain did some interviews. He did it in a couple of different places. He did it with travel agents, and he did it also with the media. And he made a couple of statements that I thought were important to think about. And when he was talking about his first statement here, he was talking about when cruising would start up again. And this was his words. He says, "I really don't know when that will be." Now, if you look at Royal Caribbean's website, they indicate that they're going to start cruising in early June. But here's the CEO of the company saying, "I don't really know when that'll be." And then a little later in that same interview, he said this. He said, "I would say the startup, depending on the circumstances and timing, will be relatively gentle. It won't be a sudden, wow, everything's operating. I think we'll put our toe in the water and begin operations and make sure that everything is perfect and make sure the guests are having a wonderful time and making sure we've got all of the protocols established." So again, right now you can pretty much book any of the ships to a lot of different destinations. You look at his words in this interview and it makes it sound very, very different than what we see. It's also interesting that, hold on a second, I'll post a comment here. If you have questions, please post them. Get the chat started here. Anyway, so we look collectively at that information, and it sounds like they're really uncertain. And right now, in fact, I saw a slide, we'll see it a little bit later, that showed where all the ships are. And it's amazing. There's not ships in position right now in general to start cruising again. So let's go on to the next slide here. So he was asked then about what kind of cruises would be the first ones to be available. And you'll notice some of his comments. He said probably the short product perfect day will be among the first to start. And he gave the reason why when he said that the great thing about the destination is we have a massive control over who comes and who goes, all of the protocols. We can manage those destinations exceptionally well. I think the private destinations will be integral to the recovery. So I was talking about Labadee and the perfect day at Coco Cay. And he's right in that even if there are problems in the mainland, either in Haiti or in the Bahamas, at Coco Cay and at Labadee, they have the control over who's there, and they have some ways to secure it. But again, they're not going to open up to a full run of itineraries. It's just not one of those things that's going to happen. Then he was asked about what was going to change on board, and I thought his comments were kind of interesting here. He said, "I think in the beginning there will not be a buffet," and then a little bit later in that quote, "Utilize the windjammer. In all probability, it won't be a classical buffet. It'll be something more akin to a restaurant." And this is one of the changes that we can expect, I think, across the board with all of the cruise lines. And the reason for that is because the buffet is very hard to manage social distancing, and you have people touching the utensils. So everybody that goes through the line and gets a particular item, everybody that follows them is going to touch the same thing. And so anybody that has any kind of contagious disease is going to share it as they go along. So that's one of the things that is going to change. It's going to make it more challenging for the cruise lines. So I think that is something that's going to happen. But again, they've got to figure out what the plan is. And again, at the time of his interview, it doesn't sound like he really knew what the plan going forward was. Anyway, and so it's just kind of interesting. We can expect from, and if we think about what Carnival did, it sounds like what Richard Fain is saying is it's going to be very similar to Carnival. So Carnival has stated that in August, starting August 1st, they're going to launch, I think it was 8 ships total out of 3 ports. And I think most of those are going to wind up going to the Bahamas and to their private islands. I think there is very limited opportunity in some of the other ports. Now, I did see it, and this is what I was mentioned earlier. I saw just very late this evening that the buzz is thinking they may be ready to start cruising July 1st, to start taking in cruise lines in Nassau on July 1st. But they hedged that significantly because they said that there's a lot of other factors involved. What I'm seeing, even within the United States and in many of the foreign countries, if you go, for example, they started talking about opening up tourism in Italy. Well, here's the thing about it. If you go to Italy as a tourist, you have to self-quarantine 14 days. So that doesn't work so well on a cruise ship. And we saw there was news out of Grand Cayman that they're not going to accept cruise passengers till September, I think it was at the earliest. There are places like the Seychelles Islands have said they're not going to take cruise passengers in 2020 at all, and 2021 is in question. So there is so much that's going to depend on what happens with the coronavirus and the things that have to be dealt with. So let's go on and we'll talk a little bit about what NCL had to say. This was an interview with Frank Del Rio on when cruises would start. And one of the early comments in his interview, he said Norwegian is planning a phased relaunch. He expects it will take up to 6 months. So now he's saying that it's going to take 6 months to relaunch. But at the same time, right now, today, you can buy June cruises. And so there starts to be, again, this disconnect between what the leaders are saying and what their websites are saying as far as when you can buy cruises. And again, I understand the why of that, because if they continue to take bookings, they're getting cash in. All 3 of the cruise lines have had to take some very drastic steps to acquire cash. Norwegian was the latest. I talked about it on the last episode, but it was in this same interview. I don't think I have the quote here, but he basically said that they can go 1.5 years without selling a single cruise. That's the cash they brought in. Well, you don't borrow that much money unless you're worried that you might need it. Just saying. So now, a little farther down in the interview, he said, we expect sailings to restart with a handful of vessels. So again, you go back to, wait a minute, we're taking bookings on pretty much all the ships to most of the destinations. And yet you say you're going to start relaunch with a handful of vessels. Again, we have this disconnect that exists. And then he said that they plan to relaunch roughly 5 ships per month. And they said more sailings will be added until the operations are fully back to normal. So it looks like, his plan is they're going to start with maybe 5 ships, and that's across 3 brands, not necessarily all NCL ships. So you start with 5 ships and you start adding 5 ships, every month. That's a lot of destinations, a lot of cruises, a lot of places that you're not going to go when you're taking, sales for pretty much anywhere right now. And then he also made this statement. He said operations and itineraries are also contingent on which ports are open to receive cruising ships. So again, we go back to it's also going to depend on what the what the ports are going to do. You can have all the ships ready to sail, and if you can't go anywhere private islands, you're not going to sell a lot of those cruises. People want to go to destinations. We'll come back to the cruise line, one thing on both of the cruise lines here in a minute. So talking about changes on board, he said, now I thought this was interesting. This first one. He said in his interview that cruise ship passengers may have to don masks, that they would see fewer tables in the dining room and fewer fellow guests aboard. when they eventually return to scene. Again, it doesn't sound like he's expecting to get back there quickly. And, he's saying that, hey, we may have to wear masks and spread out the tables in the dining room. Ask about the buffet. Would the self-service buffet be back? He said likely not. So we're starting to see some consensus from the line. And I think that this will actually be a CLIA mandated standard. CLIA is working with the CDC and with all the cruise lines. They're trying to develop a set of guidelines that will provide, a safe environment for the passengers. And then Del Rio said finally that the resume of service would be different process for each cruise company. And at this point, he said he's glad his fleet is smaller because he's got less ships to get started. And one of the things that is important in starting it up is a lot of these cruise lines now are putting their ships into what's called cold layup. And cold layup means that they've taken all the linens and all the fabric stuff and put it in an environmentally secure storage and keep them dry. They've gotten pretty much everybody off the ship except a minimal safety crew. So, and we're going to go to a little piece of this in just a second. But the end result of that is that to get that ship back up and ready may be a month-long process. But they do that because the cost of doing that is so much less than having the ship at what's called a warm layup status, which means that they've got minimal crew on board, but they can get really quickly. They're still running all the systems, and they have, more crew in a cold layup, but a long ways from being ready to set. One thing he's talking about wearing masks. An interesting question came up on one of the boards. If we have to maintain social distancing on a cruise ship, the question is how do you do that in those little itty bitty narrow halls? And I responded back to that comment. I said, one way, each hallway. One way goes forward, one way goes aft, and you just cross over when you get to you can get cabin. But that's the challenge, is that if we still have to practice social distancing, how do you do that on a cruise ship? How do you keep people safe? And even the bigger question, and this is the one that I think is the most important question, is do we have a protocol that in the event somebody comes down with something like COVID, because it may be the coronavirus that get them initially, but let's say that the next version of a virus comes out, or the coronavirus starts to make a second round. What we can't deal with, and what could possibly be fatal cruise lines for the future, is if we get another Diamond Prince, where we got people on board that are sick, and we just keep them there, and they keep spreading it to everybody else on the ship. And the end result is we have again another video series of a ship full of sick people trying to get off. So between the Coast Guard, the CDC, and the cruise lines, and this is going to have to be done on a country-by-country basis, but there needs to be a way to treat them on board, and there needs to be a way to get people off the ship in the case that something does happen. Because I know for myself and my wife, and for a lot of people, what we don't want to be is a prisoner on a cruise ship. We'll talk about that a little more in just a second. So we're going to talk about what they didn't say and what it means. They didn't say which ports will be open, and that means they probably don't know, and they don't know what the itineraries you see published today probably are not going to be the itineraries that really go, that will actually sail. The other question is what about air travel? All the airlines are starting to lay off flight attendants. They're starting to lay off flight crews. They're mothballing airplanes. So once things start to ramp back up, what kind of options are there going to be to get people to the ships? One of the reasons that I am very comfortable, one of the reasons that Carnival laid out the plan they did, is because they have huge populations close to the ports they're going to use. And so most of the people can get to the ship by driving, because driving right now is the one thing that is reliable and is open. Though it is interesting, again, talking about that, there are some of the states, depending on where you're driving in from, you have a 14-day quarantine. Okay, so you want to go in and spend one night and go to the ship, 14-day quarantine. Again, you start to look at all of these logistics and all these pieces that have to come together, and you say, how do we make these things happen? Again, so we don't know which ports and which ships, so we really have no idea, other than with Carnival, what the future looks like. And Carnival, I think, is still iffy with what they said. I mean, I think that's their best guess. I think they're serious about trying to do that. But like I said, I wouldn't be betting money on it. I wouldn't be buying non-refundable tickets to fly if that was my option. Here's an interesting thing too, and this goes back to what I was talking about being trapped on a ship. Right now in the bay, there are 20 cruise ships full of crew, literally probably 100,000 crew members or so. No, maybe not. That's a little bit overestimated. But there are multiple tens of thousands of crew members sitting on ships in Manila Bay looking at their homeland, and they can't get off the ship to get to the homeland. And so this starts to come into play. First of all, going back to what I said about CDC, Coast Guard, cruise lines finding a protocol to get people off the ship. Second piece of it is if those 20 cruise ships are on the schedule to go somewhere next month, and they're sitting in Manila with a load of crew members that they can't get off, I don't see that working very well. And it's about 30 days sea time from Manila, depending on how much fuel they're willing to burn, to get back. So those aren't going to be available for June 1st. Again, what I can say from all of this is, and this is the bottom line down here at the bottom, I am absolutely convinced that the cruises aren't going to start in June. I don't think they're going to start in July. And make the point there that Carnival's saying August. I think that is a question mark. I don't think that we're anywhere near. And a lot of people are saying, "Well, why are you so negative?" I'm not negative. I would give anything if I go on a cruise right now. My wife's not quite as enthused as I am, but literally, if I felt safe, I would go get on a cruise ship and go somewhere tomorrow. Because I love to cruise. I love to be at sea. I'm looking forward to a time when we can be back at sea safely. But I'm not sure that August is when that's going to happen. Hopefully you got some value out of this. If you did, do me a favor, smash the like button and the subscribe button. And by the way, here's a graphic I wanted to show you. Those are the ships right now that are in. Those are the ships that are in Manila Bay. And like I said, here's some other things that I did have started to close the show down. I wasn't quite done. Anyway, the cruises are not going to start June, not in Alaska. Said that the ship aren't going to sail full. They're going to limit the number of passengers, and that's going to have an impact on those and some of the other things that are available. Like I said, buffets aren't going to be buffets, and social distancing and masks may be required on board when we get started. And again, then you start to say, okay, well, if masks are required on board, what if somebody won't wear one? Are they going to throw them overboard? Are they going to put them in the brig? Or are they just going to let them walk around exposing other people to whatever they have? So all of these things are questions that have to get resolved before they can start sailing again. Anyway, so if you're watching the replay, what you'll find is there'll be videos that I suggest for your next videos and a chance to subscribe. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.